Sophia nodded, her face pale, her voice trembling with fear. Yes, that's exactly it. It's as if we've torn a hole in space-time, one that's slowly growing. And it's not just an isolated event. This pulse is radiating out, affecting everything around us. James stepped forward, his face grim. How far is it reaching? How much time do we have before it spreads beyond our control? Eva looked at the dark expanse outside the ship. Her thoughts were a blur. She had never imagined that their actions would have this kind of far-reaching effect. When they detonated the core, they thought they were destroying the machine, stopping the alien plan before it could reach its conclusion. But now it seemed as though they had triggered a chain reaction, one that had sent shockwaves through the very foundations of space itself. I don't know, Sophia said, her fingers flying over the console. But I can tell you this, it's not just radiating outward. It's warping the surrounding space, pulling things out of alignment. Stars, galaxies, everything in this region is being affected. If this continues, we could see entire star systems pulled into gravitational collapse, or worse, torn apart by the growing rift. James swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. You mean a singularity? The kind of thing we were trying to prevent. Sophia looked up at him, her expression hollow. Worse, it's not just one singularity. It's multiple points of collapse, all connected, all feeding into each other. The rift is growing, and if it reaches critical mass, it could unravel the entire galaxy. Eva clenched her fists. How do we stop it? Sophia shook her head, her hands trembling as she looked at the readings on the screen. We can't. I don't think we can. Not unless we find the source of the rift and close it. But even then, we might not have the power to fix what we've done. James was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the blinking indicators that filled the console. We need to warn Earth. We need to get this information back home. If we don't, they'll never understand the full scope of what we've unleashed. They won't have a chance to prepare. Eva hesitated. And if we don't stop it, Earth might be the first to feel the rift's effects. We've already seen how the structure was manipulating human minds. If it's still connected to us somehow. Her voice trailed off. The thought was unbearable. If the rift's influence spread further, humanity could fall victim to the alien intelligence once more. Only this time, it wouldn't just be an experiment. It would be the end of everything they knew. Sophia's eyes flickered with something between fear and determination. If we can't stop it from here, maybe there's another way. We've been focusing on the immediate threat, the alien structure. But what if the source of the rift isn't just something we can destroy? What if it's a part of something bigger, something that spans across the universe? Eva blinked, trying to make sense of Sophia's words. What are you saying? Sophia turned to her, urgency in her voice. What if the aliens didn't just create the convergence, they initiated it? What if the rift we're seeing isn't just a side effect of their experiment, but the actual result of their manipulation of space-time? James frowned. So, you're saying the aliens didn't just want to create a singularity. They wanted to tear apart the entire universe and reshape it? Sophia nodded slowly. Exactly. The signal we're detecting, it's not random. It's not an accident. It's a message. A call. They're trying to open a path. And if we don't find a way to block it, that path will lead straight into the heart of the universe itself. Eva's mind raced, connecting the pieces. The aliens had been trying to manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe. They had been using humanity as vessels in their experiment, but now it seemed like the real plan wasn't just to observe, it was to alter reality itself. To collapse the universe and rebuild it according to their own design. How do we stop it? Eva asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
They entered a small, excessively modernistic office. Behind the desk sat a woman matching his preconceptions, oversized circular glasses, vivid blue hair, and green nail polish creating an almost radioactive appearance on her hands. She greeted them with artificial warmth, directing them to sit. Notably unusual was the absence of any other individuals, no receptionist, no additional clients, just the three of them. The woman, presumably Sarah, folded her hands and smiled. So how are we doing today? He glanced at Grace before returning his attention to Sarah. Confused, he stated frankly. Sarah remained unresponsive. Instead, she turned toward Grace and, with a subtle nod, said, "Grace, you have something to tell Dominic." His attention shifted to Grace, who inhaled deeply, her hands slightly tensing in her lap. Then, the revelation finally emerged. "I want a divorce. I just can't take it anymore." For a moment, he sat processing this information. He observed Grace, then Sarah, then returned to Grace. There was no anger, no shock, no emotional display. He exhaled slowly, nodded, and responded, "Okay, let me make the arrangements." He stood, prepared to exit. Nothing further required discussion. As he reached the door, Grace's voice, tinged with confusion and disbelief, halted him. "Okay, that's it." She stared at him as though expecting resistance, confrontation. Turning back, he confirmed, "Yes, that's it." For a second, she sat processing his response. Her mouth slightly parted as though additional words existed but remained unspoken. He didn't wait for her to formulate a response. He departed, leaving her with Sarah Jo Shamout. He didn't provide transportation home or inquire about her return arrangements. That responsibility now belonged to her. Entering his vehicle, he lowered the windows, allowing urban air to envelop him during the drive. No sadness, no anger, simply a sense of finality. He stopped at a diner, consumed a burger with fries, and decided to watch a film, something loud, action-oriented, and meaningless. Precisely what the situation required. Upon returning home, he wasted no time. He gathered his belongings, packed his possessions, and relocated to the spare room. No shouting, no emotional declarations, just action. When she eventually returned that evening, he heard the front door open, heard her footsteps entering. However, he offered no greeting, didn't turn to look at her, provided no acknowledgement whatsoever. That night, for the first time since their wedding, he neither spoke to her nor exchanged a goodnight kiss. The following morning, he awoke early, dressed, and proceeded directly to his office. No hesitation, no reconsideration, just decisive action. Logging into his accounts, he initiated necessary changes. First, adjusting his 401k, ensuring complete personal control. Then, visiting the bank to separate their accounts and cancel shared credit cards. Following this, he contacted insurance companies to remove her from all policies, health, automotive, life. She desired separation. Separation was granted. Subsequently, he contacted his attorney. She wants a divorce, he stated, directly addressing the matter. I'll wire you the retainer fee today. Be prepared. I can guarantee that she is stupid enough not to file first. Most probably, I'll have to file. I will call and let you know when. Upon completion, he made another call, this time to the property owner. Take my name off the lease, he instructed. I don't need that house anymore. The property wasn't worth the complications. He would find alternative accommodation, something with proximity to employment, something exclusively his. By evening, he felt unburdened, liberated. He visited Walmart, purchased God of War, Ragnarok, and returned home. Immediately upon entry, he activated his PlayStation, obtained a beverage, and commenced playing. No contemplation, no overanalysis, just himself and Kratos decimating adversaries. He remained engaged when Grace entered. Initially, she remained silent, merely approaching and sitting beside him on the sofa. He recognized she anticipated acknowledgement, but none was provided. He maintained focus on the screen, his fingers manipulating the controller as though her presence was non-existent. Eventually, after what seemed like extended silence, she spoke. How do you want to do this? He paused the game, set down the controller, and turned toward her. You've been removed from all my insurances. Our bank accounts have been separated. The lease on the house is now under your name only. It expires in 2 months, so you'll have to renew it if you re-staying. He maintained unwavering eye contact. Are you going to get me served at the office? Or will the divorce papers be delivered at home? Grace blinked, appearing caught unprepared. She hesitated before responding, I haven't filed for divorce yet. Without reaction, he retrieved his phone, dialed his attorney, and activated the speakerphone. Go ahead and file the divorce papers, he instructed upon answer. And as per the prenup, we walk away with what we brought into the marriage. The money in the joint account was mine, and it will remain with me. He sensed Grace's escalating anger beside him but remained indifferent. She had made her decision, he was merely executing it. Without additional words, she stood, jaw clenched, and departed the room angrily. 2 days later, he packed his remaining possessions and permanently vacated the residence. No prolonged farewells, no lingering emotions, just the clean separation Grace had requested. 5 days afterward, she received the divorce documents. Irreconcilable differences. Simple, direct, separate paths. She called that evening, but he allowed it to ring unanswered. Then came a text message. So much for love and commitment. He examined the screen momentarily, then sent a simple thumbs-up emoji before setting his phone aside. No conversation necessary. No explanations required. She had made her choice, he was ensuring its realization. 2 days later, his phone rang again. This time, her attorney called. She wanted to schedule a meeting to finalize terms and expedite proceedings. He agreed, and the following day, entered the attorney's office accompanied by his lawyer, Ron Jeremy. Grace was already present, seated across the table with her friend, Lana Rhodes. A single glance at her prompted a slight headshake. Who names these people? The meeting commenced, and her lawyer, Alexis Texas, cleared her throat. Grace is entitled to maintenance and 50% of the marital assets. His lawyer leaned forward, tone calm but resolute. Kindly mention these assets. Alexis provided a list, which he briefly reviewed. Even his PlayStation 5 was included. Naturally, Ron examined the list, perused it. Then, with the most casual expression, folded it and placed it in his pocket. I hope I can keep this as a souvenir. He nearly laughed. Yeah, you can Google that too. They stood, and Ron buttoned his suit jacket, directly addressing them with a smirk. I'll meet you ladies where I perform. In court. Have a nice day. 3 weeks later, they appeared in court. Grace's attorney immediately characterized him as the villain, an absent husband, emotionally neglectful, solely interested in sexual activities, video games, and male social interactions. She elaborated on his alleged lack of emotional investment, how he supposedly left her feeling depleted and unsupported, how he had purportedly abandoned her in chaos. He observed the performance unfold, arms crossed. When she concluded, his lawyer, Ron, stood and adjusted his attire. Your Honor, may I ask the petitioner a few questions? The judge nodded. Proceed. Grace was summoned to testify. She approached with the confidence of someone believing every word previously stated. She sat, back erect, hands folded in her lap, prepared to portray victimhood. Ron stepped forward, voice calm but firm. Mrs. Miller, they alleged that Mr. Miller did not pay attention to you. Is that correct? Yes, she replied without hesitation. Ron nodded, turning a page in his notes. Did he ever take you out on dates? Before the marriage, yes. After the marriage, no. Ron remained expressionless. Instead, he retrieved a file from his briefcase and presented it to the court official. Your Honor, this is the credit card statement from Mr. Miller detailing payments made at various restaurants over the last 6 months. Grace's lawyer prepared to object, but Ron continued without interruption. Now, before opposing counsel tries to discredit this evidence, we also have video footage from these restaurants, showing Mr. Miller and Mrs. Miller walking in together and leaving together. Ron proceeded without delay. He turned back to the judge, his voice sharp and unwavering. Your Honor, Mr. Miller took his wife out twice every week. He then displayed printed documents. As for video games, we have screenshots from Mr. Miller's PlayStation account detailing his weekly gaming hours. The numbers clearly contradict Mrs. Miller's claims that he was always glued to his console. Then Ron redirected attention to Grace. Mrs. Miller, did Mr. Miller ever give you gifts? As anticipated, she raised her chin and responded, no. Ron smirked. He indicated the very clothing she wore, the footwear she had on. Interesting, he said, producing another set of documents and submitting them to the court official. Your Honor, these are the receipts for the exact outfit Mrs. Miller is wearing today. Every single piece of it, paid for by my client. Grace shifted uncomfortably, but Ron continued. He stepped forward, directly addressing her. Mrs. Miller, it is clear that you have lied about most of the allegations against my client. Now let me ask you, what did you contribute to this marriage? The courtroom fell silent. Grace hesitated before finally responding, I gave him gifts. Ron raised his hand, displaying 5 fingers. Name 5. Grace straightened. I gave him his PS5. Ron immediately countered. My client paid for it. It's on his credit card. She quickly retorted. I gave him his wedding ring. Ron sighed, shaking his head. Once again, he paid for it. Right here, on his credit card statement. He displayed another receipt. What else, Mrs. Miller? Grace's expression tightened. I contributed to the household. Ron raised an eyebrow. Like what? She remained silent. He allowed the silence to persist before straightening his posture and delivering the final argument. You are in the same salary as Mr. Miller. Yet ever since you've been with him, you have not paid a single penny out of your pocket. Not a single gift. Not a single dinner bill. Not a single deposit into the joint account. And yet, here you are, claiming at the top of your voice, I am entitled. Ron adjusted his necktie and returned attention to Grace, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Miller, you wanted this divorce in the first place, correct? Grace hesitated, then gave a small nod. Ron continued, voice calm but firm. It is clear that my client has done everything that a husband can do. He retrieved another document from the table and presented it to the court official. Here is a medical test report confirming that my client is not impotent. So it is not sex. It is not lack of attention. It is not emotional torture. And it is certainly not domestic abuse. He allowed the words to settle before stepping forward. So I asked you again, Mrs. Miller, why did you want a divorce? Grace's voice resonated through the courtroom, sharp and filled with frustration. I want an alpha man, and Dominic is not an alpha man. Ron raised an eyebrow, tone steady. Can you define an alpha man, Mrs. Miller? She hesitated, considering carefully before answering. He should fight for me, fight for our marriage. Ron leaned forward, voice calm but insistent. And who, exactly, was he supposed to fight against? Grace blinked, caught unprepared. She faltered. Ron persisted. Mrs. Miller, you said fight. Who was he supposed to fight? She inhaled deeply. You should have fought for our marriage. You should have told me he didn't want a divorce. Ron's gaze narrowed. But you wanted the divorce, Mrs. Miller. You started this wildfire. He approached closer, voice rising. Let me ask you again, what did you really want? Then she erupted. I wanted him to beg me to stop the divorce. Grace shouted, face flushed with anger. He should have gone on his knees to stop me. Ron's voice returned forcefully, unwavering. Why, Mrs. Miller? Why should a husband beg his wife? Isn't marriage supposed to be an equal responsibility? What makes a wife greater than her husband? What makes a woman who, in the past year, has contributed nothing to her marriage believe she deserves her husband to beg for her? Grace fell silent. Ron continued, his voice lowering, almost taunting. You say you want an alpha man? In the wild, every animal in the herd bows to the alpha. If your husband were to turn into one, would you bow to him? Grace's lips parted, but words failed her. Ron shook his head. Mrs. Miller, your husband might not be an alpha man. He turned toward Dominic, voice firm. But he is a respectable man. Ron proceeded without restraint. He turned to Grace, voice steady but containing quiet intensity. He did everything a respectable man would do for his wife. He took you out to dinners, catered to your needs, stood by you in sickness and in health. He took you to movies, showered you with gifts, gave you his time, his attention. Tell me, Mrs. Miller, what else is a man supposed to do? Grace attempted to speak, but no words emerged. Ron continued, his words penetrating the silence decisively. Mrs. Miller, you identify as a feminist, don't you? I have your social media profile here. He displayed numerous printed screenshots. You talk about equal pay for women, about fairness in the workplace. Is that correct? Grace straightened, raising her chin proudly. Yes, she stated firmly. Ron moved closer. Then tell me, why did you not contribute to your marriage equally? In the past year, not a single gift bought with your money, not a single contribution to the joint account. You expect equality in the workplace, yet in your own home, you expected him to provide everything while you gave nothing. Is this bold talk of equality only for social media? Grace's complexion paled, lips compressed as she maintained silence. Ron shook his head, voice expressing disappointment. I am sorry to say this, Mrs. Miller, but your words do not match your actions. They are just as hollow as your commitment to your marriage. You purposely dragged your unsuspecting husband to a marriage counselor, so you could ambush him with a woman you agreed with you. And you wanted a 2-on-1 assault on your husband. It was his patience that wrecked your evil plan. That is so twisted and disgusting, Mrs. Miller. Ron allowed silence to extend momentarily. Then inhaled deeply and returned attention to Grace. His voice remained firm, though now containing exasperation. Now, once again, Mrs. Miller, he said, maintaining eye contact, we still cannot pinpoint why you want a divorce. Grace fidgeted, glancing toward her attorney as though seeking escape. None existed. Everyone present had witnessed the exchange. It wasn't about abuse, neglect, or infidelity. She lacked justification for her actions. Ron extended his arms. Vade told us it wasn't because of a lack of love, not because of mistreatment, not because of anything Dominic did or didn't do. So tell me, Mrs. Miller, what exactly are we doing here? Grace swallowed nervously, hands trembling slightly, but remained silent. Grace glanced at her lawyer, then finally responded. My marriage counselor told me that I should get a divorce. Ron arched an eyebrow. I see. That would be Miss Sarah Jo Shamout. One of the witnesses your lawyer has brought here today, correct? Grace nodded. Without hesitation, Ron addressed the judge. Your Honor, I would like to ask a few questions to Miss Sarah Jo Shamout. The judge provided slight acknowledgement, and Grace stood, departing as a professionally attired woman approached the witness stand. She adjusted her position as Ron turned toward her. Miss Shamout, he began. Where did you receive your training as a marriage counselor? University of Florida, she replied confidently. Great, Ron said politely. How many sessions did you have with Mrs. Miller? 2, she answered. Ron raised an eyebrow. Wow, he murmured quietly before leaning forward. And how many did you have with Mr. Miller? She shifted slightly. None. Ron tilted his head, feigning misunderstanding. None? Miss Shamout merely nodded. Ron exhaled dramatically, turning slightly toward the judge before returning attention to her. So let me get this straight. You had no sessions with the husband, and yet, you recommended the wife for a divorce. Ron crossed his arms, regarding Miss Shamout with mild amusement. Is that normal, Miss Shamout? She nodded confidently. Yes. Ron emitted a brief chuckle and retrieved a printed document from his briefcase. Interesting, he said, unfolding it dramatically. Because I went out and found this on the internet. He cleared his throat and read aloud. On the Google business page, one of your clients writes, she is a fraud. Told me I should get a divorce on my first session. 2 months later, I am happy with my husband, all thanks to my decision to drop that blue-haired witch. Grace's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Miss Shamout's expression remained neutral, though tension was visible in her jaw. Ron continued, turning the page. Here's another one. She kept insisting that my husband was the problem and divorce was the only solution. Thankfully, we saw a second opinion, and my husband and I are now stronger than ever. He turned to another. Oh, this one's good. Worst counselor ever. She pushes for divorce instead of helping couples. I regret ever listening to her advice. Ron finally looked up, expression unreadable. Miss Shamout, he said, voice calm but resolute, what is the role of a marriage counselor? She straightened in her seat. It is to listen to the couple and help them sort out their issues by being a mediator and helping them see each other's feelings. Ron applauded, slow and deliberate. That, he said, nodding, is a textbook definition. But unfortunately, you did not follow the basics. He approached closer, voice containing restrained sarcasm. You recommended Mrs. Miller a divorce without even talking to Mr. Miller. Ron turned sharply toward the judge. Your Honor, I would like to formally request that this court initiate an investigation into Miss Shamout's practice, he declared. We need to determine just how many wrongful divorces she has influenced. A marriage counselor should mediate, not dictate, and if necessary, I urge this court to revoke her ability to counsel people altogether. Murmurs spread throughout the courtroom. Miss Shamout visibly tensed, gripping her chair as though bracing for impact. Grace's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the complexity this case had assumed. This wasn't about salvaging the marriage anymore. That possibility disappeared when Grace determined he wasn't sufficiently alpha for her preferences. This concerned accountability. If he had to endure having his life disrupted, then so should the woman who recklessly destroyed marriages without consulting both parties. The judge massaged his temples, exhaling sharply. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Ron. The court will review your request and determine the necessary course of action." Ron nodded and retreated. Grace remained motionless, staring downward. This clearly deviated from her expectations, but that no longer mattered. Grace's lawyer stood, smoothing her attire before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to ask Mr. Miller a few questions." The judge acknowledged. "Proceed." Dominic exhaled and approached the witness chair, settling in preparation for whatever absurdity might follow. Grace's lawyer clasped her hands. "Mr. Miller," she began, slightly tilting her head, "when Mrs. Miller asked you for a divorce, what did you do?" He maintained eye contact as she awaited his response. He shrugged. "I gave her what she wanted. She wanted a divorce. Here she is, getting a divorce." Several laughs echoed through the courtroom. Even Ron smiled beside him. The judge, unimpressed, used his gavel. "Order in the court." Grace's lawyer adjusted her posture, regaining composure. "Mr. Miller, why didn't you try to stop her? Or should I say, win her back?" He reclined in his chair, maintaining calm tone. "If there was a problem in the marriage, I should have been the first person she talked to. Yet she went to a so-called counselor, who's rated a whopping 1.1 stars on Google." He paused momentarily before continuing. "She ambushed me by taking me to this counselor. Didn't tell me where we were going. Didn't say why. All she said was that it was important to her. When we got there, she just told me she wanted a divorce. No discussion. No attempt to fix whatever imaginary issue she had. She is supposed to be my wife, and a wife is not a territory that I need to keep winning over. I have made every effort to keep her happy and satisfied, but till date I have no clue as to why she wanted a divorce. She never talked about it. Now I don't want to know about it. It was important to her, so I am giving her exactly what she wants." Her lawyer compressed her lips, then asked, "Why are you refusing to agree to the settlement terms?" He laughed briefly. "I think my lawyer has already explained it with evidence. She didn't bring anything into this marriage. Not before, not after. So she doesn't get anything. Besides," he added, glancing at Ron, who appeared prepared to intervene, "we both signed a prenup that her lawyer drafted and vetted by my lawyer. We following it to the letter." By now, Grace's lawyer had exhausted her arguments. Her expression tightened as she returned attention to the judge. "I do not have any more questions." The judge adjourned proceedings, and for the subsequent 3 months, his phone constantly notified him of messages. Friends, family, even distant acquaintances suddenly expressed opinions, all encouraging reconciliation with Grace, as though he hadn't spent years doing everything possible for someone who discarded it all. He ignored everyone. Instead, he spent evenings playing God of War, allowing Kratos' rage to energize him as he eliminated enemies. Then, unexpectedly, Grace called. "I want to meet," she said, her voice softer than remembered. "No," he stated flatly. She fell silent, then sighed. "Dominic, please." He terminated the call. Nothing remained to discuss. Several weeks later, the judge ordered counseling. He refused. "Your Honor, I have no love left for her," he stated without hesitation. The judge appeared displeased. His scowl seemed almost amusing. However, before he could argue, Ron intervened smoothly. "Your Honor, a husband can only love to a certain point. But if that love is never reciprocated, it dies. That's what happened here." Momentarily, the courtroom remained silent. Then, the judge exhaled, massaging his temples. Finally, he reluctantly nodded. "Very well." Thus, the divorce was granted. No alimony. No settlements. Nothing. Grace entered this marriage with nothing and departed with exactly that, nothing. He understood she expected him to falter, to plead, to humiliate himself like some lovesick individual. But that was never going to occur. Finally, liberation arrived. No more meaningless conflicts. No more ungrateful demands. No more pretense. Now, he has decided to temporarily suspend romantic pursuits and concentrate entirely on professional development. Dear viewers, please share your perspectives in the comment section below. And remember to like, share, and subscribe.